This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, we now bring you a discussion on the ASEAN-India Summit and East Asia Summit. The participants are Anil Wadhwa, former ambassador, and Arjun J. Chaudhary, AIR correspondent.
I'm joined by Shri Anil Wadhwa, former ambassador to the Government of India, and in our discussion we will cover the ASEAN-India Summit and the East Asia Summit, which is being visited by Vice President Jagdeep Dhankar, and he's accompanied by External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar. And in today's program, we'll try to understand what is the importance of the summit, what is it that India's interests are and how they are being protected, and how is it that the member countries are going to further their interests at this summit itself. Mr. Wadhwa, what is the importance of this summit, the ASEAN-India and the East Asia Summit, and why is it that the dignitaries attending, the Vice President Jagdeep Dhankar and External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, they are attending this summit? What is the importance of this attendance and what does this mean for India?
First of all, the ASEAN-India Summit, this is the commemorative summit because we've completed 30 years of India-ASEAN relations. This year is being celebrated as ASEAN-India Friendship Year in 2022. And then we also have the 17th East Asia Summit. Now, East Asia Summit deals with security and defense issues besides a number of other cooperative areas. And in both these summit meetings, the leadership actually puts forward their viewpoints on how the relationship is going to go forward, especially the India-ASEAN Summit, which is particularly important for India's relationship with the ASEAN countries. So I believe at this particular summit, there would be an extensive discussion on geopolitical issues like developments in the Indo-Pacific, the threat of terrorism, and of course the current situation in Myanmar and Ukraine. But besides this, India always looks for major topics like review of our trade and our investments with the ASEAN countries. And lately, in the last decade or so, connectivity has emerged as a major issue coming up for discussions because of the number of projects that India has undertaken with the ASEAN countries. And finally, of course, this being the commemorative summit, we will review the status of the strategic alliance. So all these make these two particular summits important in the diplomatic calendar of India. And normally, Prime Minister Modi would have attended, but he has to also attend the G20 summit, which is going to follow very shortly in Bali. India is taking over the G20 presidency from Indonesia, and therefore, Vice President is leading the Indian delegation.
So, Mr. Wadhwa, you spoke about how important it is to show leadership at these summits. We have the representation from India. And as you mentioned earlier, that the regional interests are being focused on. And more importantly, the East Asia Summit is being strengthened by the ASEAN-India partnership here. Could you tell us exactly how maritime security is being approached? Because India is a border state to China, for instance, and there is Southeast Asia as well, where our trade interests lie.
At this particular East Asia Summit, there have been different plans of action which have been prepared in advance. And that happens because there is normally an officials level meeting which is held ahead of the summit meeting, and that is followed by a foreign ministers meeting, and then that prepares the grounds for documentation for this summit. So the plans of action relate to cooperation in environment and energy, in education, in finance, global health issues and pandemic diseases, natural disaster management, and also ASEAN connectivity. But besides this, the East Asia Summit will also discuss cooperation in food security, in trade and economics, and as you pointed out, maritime security and cooperation, and traditional and non-traditional security threats. Normally, the format of the summit follows statements by leaders of the countries concerned, and then afterwards, if there is room, the discussion takes place on specific issues. Maritime security has emerged as a very important component of the East Asia Summit because it deals normally with security and defense issues exclusively in a separate segment. This time around, it will depend on whether there is enough time for that kind of a discussion. But nonetheless, many of the leaders would refer to maritime security in their discourse, in their speeches. And of course, for India, maritime security was an important theme which was adapted by us after our strategic partnership developed And the last time, in 2008, when the leadership of the ASEAN came to New Delhi for the 2018 meeting, and at that point in time, India also came up with the India's Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. It's called IPOI, which has 7 separate pillars. Now, if you look at those 7 separate pillars, you have maritime security, marine ecology, maritime resources, besides capacity building and resource sharing and disaster risk reduction and management, and science and technology cooperation, plus state connectivity and maritime transport. So the maritime issues dominate in this narrative, and India has worked with like-minded partners in the ASEAN region, in the Indo-Pacific region in particular, to develop these themes and to work on specific issues with regard to the region. That's why the maritime security aspect is being paid attention to. The other aspect which we have constantly faced in the last decade in the context of the ASEAN countries has been the dispute in the South China Sea, given China's position vis-a-vis a number of other countries based on its historical claims according to the Nine-Dash Line. Now, of course, that has been struck down by the UNCLOS, by the International Court, based on the UNCLOS agreement, but at the same time not accepted by China. So a code of conduct is being negotiated right now between China and the ASEAN countries. The discussions have been ongoing for a number of years. The very fact that that's being discussed shows how important it is for the ASEAN countries to reach an agreement on a code of conduct in this region.
Well, what trade blockade has resulted is a supply chain disruption, which is not just attributed to what happened because of the COVID pandemic, but also because of China's stand regarding Taiwan and certain disputed regions or islands that Japan holds. And that's led to a supply chain issue when it comes to countries like India, which depend upon key imports like chips from Taiwan. And now we have foreign direct investment in Gujarat to counter that, but it's not completely resolved. So how do you see maritime transport and port development as a way forward, and that could be discussed at this summit?
So maritime transportation came under stress because of the Ukraine war. Not so much, I would say, because of what is happening in the South China Sea by way of conflict, because there was no blockade which was imposed, but there's a fear that it could be imposed at any given point in time in the future. And because of that, countries around the world have started thinking about nearshoring or friendshoring, as we call it, and not be dependent on either one country or two countries or countries which are far away from their shores for critical supplies. So that is how this whole concept of the resilient supply chains came up, and India, Japan, and Australia formed a group to make sure that they work on critical areas which are important for them and cooperate in terms of trade in those particular commodities, because the emphasis now is on trade with reliable partners in inverted commas. And therefore, this trend is being strengthened going forward. We already see that happening in Europe in terms of making sure that they have individual capacities within Europe itself, and in the United States, which has decided that United States companies should come back and work in the United States, and even in Japan, which started exhorting its own companies to diversify and to go on to other Asian countries in order that it was not totally dependent on China. So all round, we see this trend happening. This will only get strengthened in the future. And while international trade and container trade has returned very much to the pre-COVID level, we still find that there are fears of dependency which could happen in the future. And that, of course, is something which is not openly talked about in forums like the East Asia Summit, but underlying this is the very important sentiment about making sure that the Indo-Pacific remains free and open, and the sea lanes of communication and trade remain open for countries who live in this region.
Since inflation is such a big topic right now internationally and regionally as well, could you tell us as to how this summit is being structured? You have the ASEAN member states comprising 10 countries, and then you have 8 dialogue partners, including India. What's the difference between the two?
Of course, the 10 countries are the original members of the ASEAN, and as we went along, a number of countries started having a relationship with the ASEAN countries. So they started off as dialogue partners, then first as sectoral partners and as dialogue partners. Then, of course, dialogue partners led to a special relationship with some countries. In the case of India, the same thing has happened. We evolved from a sectoral dialogue partner in 1992 to a dialogue partner in 1996. And then we went on to become a dialogue partner at the summit level in 2002. And in 2012, our relationship was changed into a strategic partnership. And from then onwards, we have been engaging the ASEAN in a number of areas, which means that there are ministerial level dialogues which are held with the ASEAN countries, besides the summit level dialogue, which is now happening at the ASEAN-India Commemorative Summit. So similarly, other dialogue partners also undertake similar dialogues, and they have their own program of action like India has. And this program of action in the case of India is for a 5-year period where you have a coordinator from the ASEAN side. For us, it is Singapore at the moment. And we then talk in terms of how this plan of action is implemented year to year. So obviously, this plan of action will also come under review at this current ASEAN-India Commemorative Summit.
Could you tell us something about the other issues like terrorism and non-proliferation? Terrorism was a major issue earlier. Is it still one today? How important is that to maritime trade and security going forward?
So terrorism remains an important issue along with developments in the South China Sea for countries of this region, for the Indo-Pacific in general. Many countries in ASEAN themselves are facing the problem of terrorism. We know that ISIS, for example, spread its wings and this led to radicalization of many societies in the region, especially Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, which saw, and also an ongoing terrorist threat in the south of Thailand, which then spread on to Myanmar and to the Rakhine region. And that we see manifesting itself into violent incidents. So obviously the ASEAN is very worried about this situation and how outside influences should be curbed. So in terms of concrete action which is happening amongst the ASEAN countries and in the context of the East Asia Summit in particular, we've had a number of resolutions and documents which have talked about de-radicalization and making sure that the societies of the region get rid of this menace and tackle this jointly. So once again, I'm sure that at this session, we will again have a lot of countries talking about it. We'll probably have a similar kind of document which will be retabled and once again reiterated.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Anil Wadhwa, for being with us on this program and talking to us extensively about the visit from India of Vice President Jagdeep Dhankar and External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar at this very important summit, which is the ASEAN-India Summit and the East Asia Summit, which is being held in the capital city of Phnom Penh in Cambodia. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on the ASEAN-India Summit and East Asia Summit. The participants were Anil Wadhwa, former ambassador, and Arjun J. Chaudhary, AIR correspondent. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsttalks@gmail.com.